The following afternoons in Thunder Creek Valley carried a weight of heavy anticipation, like storm clouds gathering over the distant peaks. Jake Sullivan and his gang had claimed Sarah's diner as their territory, transforming the once peaceful establishment into a den of intimidation. While most townsfolk kept their distance, none of them noticed how old Ezra Hawkins' weathered hands grew steady as steel whenever the thugs passed by his porch, or how his eyes tracked them with the precision of a hawk stalking its prey. They were about to learn that some legends don't fade, they just gather dust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra, special for you. In the shadow of the granite mountains, where windswept pines meet endless Montana skies, an old man rocks gently on his weather-beaten porch, his calloused hands trembling as they rest on the arms of his chair. The locals of Thunder Creek Valley know him only as Ezra Hawkins, the quiet old-timer who keeps to himself, occasionally sharing stories about weather patterns with passing children and feeding the stray cats that gather at his feet. What they don't know, what none of them suspect, is that those shaking hands once belonged to the most legendary exhibition shooter the Western Territories had ever known. The scorching Montana sun beats down mercilessly on Thunder Creek Valley, a small town nestled between towering granite cliffs and endless stretches of prairie grass. Like clockwork every morning, Ezra Hawkins emerges from his modest cabin, settling into his ancient rocking chair with the deliberate movements of a man who has seen more sunrises than he cares to count. His silver-streaked hair catches the morning light, and his scuffed boots tell tales of 1,000 forgotten trails. To the townsfolk passing by, he's just another old-timer living out his twilight years, watching the world drift past through time-weary eyes. Most folks in town know him as the quiet soul who visits Sarah Miller's diner every Tuesday for a bowl of beef stew and black coffee, never touching whiskey, though no one knows the reason why. Sometimes the children stop by his porch for the butterscotch candies he keeps in his jacket pocket, and he tells them stories about the prairie, which plants heal, which ones harm, and how to read messages in the clouds. Young Tommy Chen, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with an insatiable curiosity about the Old West, has taken a particular shine to the elderly man. He often sits cross-legged on Hawkins's porch steps, hanging on every soft-spoken word about the land and its secrets. What Tommy doesn't know, what no one in Thunder Creek Valley knows, is that the gentleness in Ezra Hawkins's voice masks decades of stories that would make even the bravest souls shudder. The peace of Thunder Creek Valley shatters the day Jake Sullivan and his gang ride into town. They're the kind of men who see kindness as weakness, the sort who take what they want and leave broken things in their wake. Jake, with his custom silver-plated revolver and black leather vest, carries himself like he owns every inch of ground beneath his boots. His right-hand man, Marcus Sullivan, is a powder keg of barely contained violence, his face permanently twisted in a sneer that reveals a gold tooth. The youngest of their crew, Ray Winters, is barely 20, trying to prove himself with every breath he takes. It doesn't take long for them to notice the old man on the porch. To them, he's the perfect target, someone who can't fight back, someone who's lived long enough to accumulate a few valuables worth taking. They don't notice the carefully oiled Winchester hidden beneath the blanket across his lap, or the fact that his trembling hands steady like bedrock the moment they wrap around a rifle stock. Sarah Miller watches from her diner's window as Sullivan's gang makes their way down the street. She's known Ezra for years, served him countless cups of coffee, and noticed things others missed, like the old photographs he keeps tucked away in his worn Bible, or how his eyes never miss a detail despite his apparent frailty. She sees how the town has changed since Sullivan's arrival, how decent folks hurry past with downcast eyes, how traveling merchants bypass Thunder Creek entirely, sensing the dangerous shift in the town's atmosphere. The first confrontation comes on a blistering Thursday morning. Sullivan and his boys had spent the night losing at poker in Sarah's diner, and their mood was as dark as storm clouds over the mountains. They stop in front of Hawkins' porch, their boots leaving dusty prints on his freshly swept boards. Well, "Look what we got here," Jake drawls, spitting tobacco juice near Hawkins's feet. "The town's official sunbather. Must be real important work you're doing there, old-timer." Hawkins's eyes, still sharp as a hawk's despite his years, take in every detail. The way Sullivan's gun rides low on his right hip, how Marcus's trigger finger twitches with nervous energy, and the way young Winters keeps shifting his weight. Unsure of himself, he says nothing, just keeps rocking. "You deaf as well as useless?" Marcus steps closer, spurs jingling discordantly. "I hear just fine," Hawkins replies softly, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age. "I see just fine, too. I see 3 men who ought to be moving along." Winters lets out a harsh laugh, trying to match his companion's cruelty. "Or what, Grandpa? You'll bore us to death with stories about the good old days?" Sheriff Daniel Cooper watches the scene unfold from across the street, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He's one of the few who's noticed how Hawkins's posture changes when Sullivan's gang prowls nearby, how his weathered frame seems to straighten imperceptibly, his gaze becoming knife-sharp despite his apparent frailty. The change in the old man's bearing reminds Cooper of something, a half-remembered story about a legendary marksman who'd vanished into retirement after cleaning up 3 territories. But such rumors remain hushed, like tumbleweeds caught in a fence at dawn. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated about Jake Sullivan's past. Bar patrons muttered about his time in Wyoming Territory, how 3 towns had emptied after his arrival, decent folk drifting away like leaves before a storm. Thunder Creek Valley seemed destined for the same fate, with Sarah's Diner serving as the epicenter of Sullivan's growing dominion. Inside the diner, Jake lounged in what he'd claimed as his personal booth, boots propped on the table while Marcus meticulously cleaned his revolver. The morning sun catching his gold tooth, Marcus watched Ray Winters pace near the window, the young man's restless energy filling the room. Their presence had already emptied the establishment of its regular customers, leaving only the hollow echo of their voices against worn walls. "Something ain't right about that old man," Winters ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted toward Hawkins's distant porch. "The way he watches, the way he sits, it's like—" He struggled to find the words. "Like a wolf pretending to be a sheep." Marcus's gold tooth glinted as he sneered. "Getting spooked by some ancient ranch hand? Maybe you ain't cut out for this life, kid." But Jake remained silent, contemplating. He'd noticed things too, subtle details that nagged at his instincts like thorns under saddle leather. The way Hawkins' eyes tracked their movements, how his posture shifted minutely when they approached, the deliberate placement of his rocking chair for maximum visibility. Sarah worked quietly behind her counter, pretending not to listen while keeping track of every word. Her fingers brushed against the small derringer hidden beneath her apron, a gift from someone long ago who'd taught her about patience and timing. She watched as Sullivan's influence spread through Thunder Creek Valley like poison in a water well. The gang had started small, demanding free meals, then protection money from Sarah's Diner. But their appetite for control grew with each passing day. The general store now closed early, its owner Rose Bennett claiming illness but really fearing the late-night visits from Marcus. The saloon across the street had become their evening court, where they held mock trials for imagined offenses against their authority. Sheriff Cooper's attempts to maintain order grew increasingly futile. With only Deputy Wilson at his side and a town council reluctant to provoke confrontation, his options dwindled. He'd seen communities crumble this way before, decent folk growing silent, malevolent men becoming bolder, until the very essence of the place withered away like unclaimed water in the desert heat. Jake rose from his booth, adjusting his silver-plated revolver. "Time we paid another visit to our sunbathing friend," he announced. "Something about him needs settling." His voice carried the cold calculation of a man used to breaking things until they fit his vision of how they should be. Marcus gathered, his cleaned gun parts with practiced efficiency. "Thinking he might have something worth taking?" Old folks tend to hoard valuables. Could be, Jake replied, his tone suggesting deeper motives. More interested in why he doesn't show proper respect. Man his age should know better than to talk back to folks who run things. Ray Winters followed them out, trying to mirror their confident stride but still betraying his uncertainty. The morning crowd parted before them like water around rocks. Townspeople ducking into doorways or suddenly finding interest in distant horizons. This was the power Jake craved, not just fear, but the way it reshaped reality around him. Tommy Chen watched their progress from his hidden perch behind Rose Bennett's rain barrel. The boy had developed an instinct for avoiding Sullivan's. Notice while keeping track of their movements. His mother had forbidden him from visiting Ezra's porch when the gang was about, but Tommy couldn't abandon his daily reconnaissance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they approached Hawkins' property, Jake noticed something that made him pause. 3 tin cans arranged with precise spacing along the fence line, each showing a single bullet hole dead center. They looked old, weather-worn, but something about their placement struck him as deliberate rather than decorative. Somebody's been practicing, Marcus observed, nudging one of the cans with his boot toe. Recent shots too, by the look of it. Jake studied the holes with growing unease. Each one was identical, placed exactly where a marksman would aim for maximum effect. His instincts, honed by years of sizing up threats, whispered warnings he couldn't quite articulate. Sarah Miller emerged from her diner, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd known Ezra long enough to recognize the signs, how his rocking chair had shifted slightly since yesterday, providing a clearer view of the street, how the blanket across his lap lay just so, concealing whatever waited beneath. "Boys," she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Your breakfast is getting cold." It was a thin excuse, but she felt compelled to intervene, to delay whatever ugly scene was building. Jake turned, annoyance flickering across, his face like heat lightning. "We'll be there when we're good and ready, woman." But he stepped back from Hawkins's property anyway, making a show of adjusting his gun belt. "We'll continue this conversation later, old man. Maybe see what kind of treasures you've got tucked away in that little cabin of yours." As they swaggered away, Tommy crept from his hiding place. "Mr. Hawkins," he whispered, climbing onto the porch, "why'd you let them talk to you like that?" Ezra's eyes, the color of faded turquoise, crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Tommy, my boy, there's something you need to learn about this world. Sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is let others think they're stronger than him." Tommy Torres would perch on his family's roof in the cool evening air, watching Hawkins' house. Through his father's borrowed binoculars, the boy noticed things others missed. How the old man checked his rifle each morning with practiced precision that seemed at odds with his trembling hands. How he positioned his rocking chair to survey both approaches to his property. How those shaking fingers became steady as stone whenever Sullivan's gang sauntered past. Sarah Miller knew more than she revealed. Late at night, after closing her diner, she'd sit in her small office counting the day's meager earnings and remembering the newspaper clippings she'd glimpsed in Hawkins' Bible. A yellowed photograph of a younger man with steel in his eyes and a star on his chest, standing over 3 notorious outlaws he'd brought to justice. The headline had read, "Lightning Hand Hawkins strikes again, 3 more bandits fall to the territory's most feared exhibition shooter." The tension in Thunder Creek Valley continued building like a rattlesnake, coiling tighter with each passing moment. Sullivan's gang grew more audacious, testing boundaries, pushing limits. They'd taken to shooting at fence posts near Hawkins' property, each bullet a message, each impact a promise of violence to come. Yet through it all, Ezra Hawkins maintained his routine with the precision of a well-oiled timepiece. Rose Bennett, the town's historian and general store owner, had begun piecing together fragments of the past. She'd noticed how the old photograph, in her store's collection showing a famous shooting competition from 20 years ago, had a familiar face in the background, younger but unmistakably Hawkins. The way he held himself in the image, trophy in hand, spoke of a man who could make a gun dance to his will. Strange thing about that competition, Rose told Sarah over morning coffee. Winner hit 9 playing cards edge on at 50 paces. Never seen anything like it before or since. They called him Lightning Hand because... She stopped as Jake Sullivan entered the diner, his presence darkening the room like storm clouds blocking the sun. Every morning, Ezra would emerge at sunrise, settle into his chair, and watch the world with eyes that held secrets deeper than the canyons surrounding their town. His hands might tremble as he offered butterscotch candies to passing children, but those who looked closely might notice how those same hands turned rock-steady whenever danger lurked nearby. Sheriff Cooper found himself visiting Hawkins' porch more frequently, ostensibly to check on the old man's welfare. During one such visit, as the evening painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, he finally voiced what had been weighing on his mind. They're not going to stop Ezra. Sooner or later, they'll push too far. Hawkins's response came soft, as distant thunder. Every man has a choice, Daniel. Even rattlesnakes give warning before they strike. The sheriff studied his companion's face, noting how the usual tremor in his hands had stilled. I've heard stories, you know, about a shooter they called Lightning Hand. Said he could hit a dime tossed in the air at 30 paces. Said he never needed more than 1 bullet per target. A ghost of a smile crossed Hawkins' weathered features. Stories have a way of growing taller than the mountains themselves. But his eyes told a different tale, one written in gun smoke and justice served beneath unforgiving skies. Deputy Wilson had started keeping a journal of unusual occurrences around Hawkins' property. The way empty bottles arranged themselves at varying distances along his back fence, each eventually showing a single perfect bullet hole. How the old man's firewood was always split with uncanny precision, the axe strikes landing exactly where they needed to. The way local wildlife seemed to give his property a wide berth, as if sensing something predatory in residence. Tommy, continuing his daily observations, noticed new details that added to the mystery. A locked trunk beneath Hawkins' bed glimpsed through the window, its brass corners worn but polished. The way Ezra could name every make of gun carried in town just by the sound of its action. How he taught Tommy to gauge distances by counting. Fence posts to read wind direction from grass blades, to spot a man's shooting hand from the way he carried his shoulder. My pa says you're different from other old-timers, Tommy confided one afternoon, helping Ezra sweep his porch. Says you move like a man who's never forgotten how to dance with death. Hawkins paused, leaning on his broom. Your pa's a perceptive man, Tommy. But remember, knowing how to dance doesn't mean you have to accept every invitation. Sarah's regular customers, the few who still braved Sullivan's presence, whispered about changes in the old man's demeanor. How his stories had shifted from simple tales about weather and wildlife to subtle lessons about timing, about watching, about understanding the difference between capability and intent. Each word seemed carefully chosen, like bullets selected for a specific purpose. The tension peaked one evening when Marcus Sullivan, drunk and belligerent, decided to test the old man's reflexes. He threw an empty bottle at Hawkins' feet. Before, the glass shattered. Ezra's cane had flicked out, catching the bottle in midair and settling it gently on his porch rail. The movement was fluid, precise, nothing like the trembling old man the town thought they knew. Interesting trick, Jake Sullivan remarked later, questioning his brother, for a man who can barely hold his coffee cup steady. Maybe we ought to tread carefully, Marcus suggested, rubbing his gold tooth nervously. Something ain't adding up about that old timer. But Jake's pride wouldn't let him back down. Not now, not after they'd established their dominance over Thunder Creek Valley. Keep watching him, he ordered. Every man's got a breaking point. We just need to find his. That night, as thunder rolled across the valley, Ezra sat in his darkened cabin, his hands steady as he cleaned an old Colt revolver. The worn steel gleamed in the lamplight, each part maintained with the dedication of a man who understood that Tools of precision required constant care. Outside, the wind carried whispers of approaching storm clouds and changing times, while Lightning Hand Hawkins prepared for a reckoning that had been building like thunder over distant peaks. Thunder echoed through the canyons surrounding Thunder Creek Valley as storm clouds gathered above the parched earth. Inside Sarah's diner, Jake Sullivan and his gang had claimed their usual table, their mere presence emptying the establishment of its regular patrons. Marcus methodically cleaned his revolver, the metal parts spread across the wooden surface, like a snake's shed skin, while Ray Winters paced near the window, his restless energy filling the room. "Boss," Winters ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. "That old man ain't what he seems. Been watching him. The way he moves when he thinks no one's looking. It's like—" He struggled to find the words. "Like a mountain lion playing at being a house cat." Jake paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. Something about Hawkins had been nagging at him too, like a splinter under the skin he couldn't quite reach. The old man's quiet defiance carried a weight that spoke of something deeper than mere stubbornness. He'd seen that kind of bearing before, in men who'd earned their confidence through blood and gun smoke. "Found something interesting," Marcus announced, pulling a worn newspaper clipping from his vest pocket. "Been asking around about retired lawmen. Seems there was one they called Lightning Hand, disappeared about 15 years back. Description: matches." He spread the yellowed paper on the table, pointing to a grainy photograph. The image showed a younger man standing over 3 bound outlaws, his stance casual but his eyes hard as steel. Jake studied the photograph, recognition slowly
dawning. The way the man held himself, the set of his shoulders. It was hauntingly familiar.
"The Franklin gang," Marcus continued, tapping the photo. "Story goes Lightning Hand took them all down single-handed, gave them each a chance to surrender, then dropped them faster than a man could blink. Never needed more than 1 shot per target." The diner grew silent, save for the drumming rain outside. Jake's face hardened into a mask of cold calculation. "Keep digging. I want to know everything about this Lightning Hand character. Where he came from, where he went, who he brought down." Sarah worked behind her counter, pretending absorption in her tasks, while straining to hear every word. Her hand brushed against the small derringer hidden in her apron pocket, remembering the day Ezra had given it to her. "Some fights," he'd told her, "are won by choosing the right moment, not the biggest gun." Sullivan's gang had grown bolder with each passing day. They'd started demanding protection money from every business in town, their requests backed by demonstrations of casual violence. Rose Bennett's general store windows had been mysteriously broken. The livery stable had suffered a suspicious fire. Each incident carried a message. Resist, and worse would follow. Through it all, Ezra Hawkins maintained his daily routine, but subtle changes caught the eye of those who knew where to look. His rocking chair now sat at a slightly different angle, providing clearer lines of sight down the main street. The tremor in his hands seemed to come and go with suspicious convenience. And Tommy Chen, ever watchful from his hidden vantage points, swore he'd seen the old man practicing with his rifle in the pre-dawn hours, hitting targets that would challenge a man half his age. "Time we tested our theory," Jake announced, rising from his booth. "If he is Lightning Hand, he's long past his prime. And if he's not—" A cruel smile played across his features. "Well, then he's just another old man who needs to learn respect." The gang made their way through the rain-slicked streets, their boots leaving heavy impressions in the mud. Thunder rolled overhead, nature's own warning of approaching violence. Sheriff Cooper watched their progress from his office window, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. He'd telegraphed for help from the territorial marshal's office, but help, if it came at all, would arrive too late to prevent whatever was building. As they approached Hawkins's property, Jake noticed new details that set his instincts humming. Fresh bullet holes in the fence posts, not the random shots his gang had fired, but precise impacts that could only come from a steady hand and a practiced eye. The old man's woodpile, each log split with geometric precision. And most telling, the way the morning's coffee cup on the porch rail had its handle aligned perfectly with the rising sun, the habit of a man who measured angles by instinct. "Remember, boys," Jake cautioned, his voice barely audible above the rain. "If he is who we think he is, he's still dangerous." Lightning Hand had a reputation for giving men one chance to walk away, just one. His hand rested on his silver-plated revolver, the metal cool against his palm. Sarah Miller emerged from her diner, defying the weather and her own fear. "Leave him be, Jake. Whatever you're thinking, it ain't worth the price you might have to pay." But Sullivan's pride had carried him too far to back down now. His reputation, his control over Thunder Creek Valley, everything hinged on how he handled this challenge to his authority. If word got out that he'd hesitated before an old man, everything he'd built would crumble like sandcastles in a storm. On his porch, Ezra Hawkins rocked steadily, seemingly oblivious to the approaching confrontation. But those who looked closely might notice how his hands had grown perfectly still, how his eyes tracked each movement with the precision of a practiced gunfighter, how his entire being seemed to have shifted from aging rancher to something altogether more dangerous. The storm clouds gathered darker overhead, nature itself holding its breath as Thunder Creek Valley teetered on the edge of a revelation that would shake it to its foundations. Lightning split the sky, and in that brief illumination, Jake Sullivan caught a glimpse of something in the old man's eyes, something that spoke of countless showdowns and perfect shots, of justice delivered at the speed of lightning, of a legend that had never truly faded. Tommy Chen sat cross-legged behind Rose Bennett's rain barrel, his father's binoculars pressed against his eyes as he watched the confrontation building at Hawkins' porch. Unlike the adults who saw only an old man facing down troublemakers, Tommy had spent weeks studying Ezra, cataloging details that others missed. His notebook, hidden beneath his mattress, contained observations that painted a different picture of the gentle old-timer who fed stray cats. Entry 27. He'd written just yesterday. Mr. Hawkins never sits with his back to a door or window, always knows where everyone is, like he's got eyes in the back of his head. When he demonstrates something, even simple things like whittling, his hands never shake, only trembles when people are watching. The rain dripped from Tommy's dark hair as he adjusted his position, careful to stay hidden while maintaining a clear view. His mother had forbidden him from coming near Sullivan's gang, but Tommy knew this moment was too important to miss. He'd appointed himself Ezra's unofficial guardian, monitoring the gang's movements with the dedication of a seasoned deputy. Sarah Miller spotted him and started to call out, but Tommy pressed a finger to his lips, shaking his head. She understood. The boy had become part of something larger than himself, a witness to events that would reshape Thunder Creek Valley. Instead of scolding him, she casually positioned herself between Tommy and Sullivan's line of sight. "Mr. Hawkins showed me something interesting yesterday," Tommy had told his mother that morning. Said a man's true character shows in how he treats those weaker than himself. Said it's not about being the fastest or the strongest. It's about knowing when to use your strength and when to hold it in reserve. Maria Chen had listened to her son's growing fascination with the old man with mixed feelings. As one of the few Chinese families in Thunder Creek Valley, they'd learned to be cautious, to avoid drawing attention. But she'd noticed changes in Tommy since he'd started spending time with Hawkins, a new confidence, a deeper understanding of the world around him. Through his binoculars, Tommy studied the tableau unfolding before him. He noticed how Ezra's rocking chair was positioned perfectly to catch the morning light and to blind anyone approaching from the street. How the seemingly casual arrangement of objects on his porch could become obstacles if someone rushed the steps. How the old man's blanket draped just so across his lap, concealing whatever waited beneath. Entry 23, Tommy's notebook recorded. Mr. Hawkins taught me about angles today. Said everything in life has an angle. Sunlight, bullets, people's intentions. Said knowing how to read angles means knowing where to be and where not to be. The boy shifted position as Sullivan's gang approached Hawkins's property. He'd developed an instinct for remaining unseen while keeping track of every movement. His mother's warnings about staying clear of trouble warred with his loyalty to the old man who'd become his mentor. Thunder rolled overhead as Tommy remembered other lessons. How Ezra had taught him to gauge distances without measuring, to read a man's intentions from the way he carried himself, to spot the difference between genuine confidence and false bravado. Each lesson, Tommy now realized, had been about more than just survival. They were about understanding, about seeing beneath the surface of things. A smart man, Hawkins had told him, learns to read situations before they turn dangerous. Notice the little things, how people stand, where their eyes go, what their hands are doing. Life and death often balance on details others overlook. Through the lens of his binoculars, Tommy watched Jake Sullivan's approach. The gang leader's confident stride masked an underlying tension, something Tommy might have missed before his lessons with Ezra. Marcus's hand kept straying to his gun, a sign of nervousness the boy had learned to recognize. Ray Winters hung back slightly, his youth and uncertainty showing in every movement. Sarah Miller caught Tommy's eye and nodded slightly. She'd been teaching him to relay messages without words, another skill Hawkins had suggested might prove useful. The boy understood her silent question. Should she intervene? Tommy shook his head. Whatever was about to happen, he sensed it needed to play out without interference. Entry 25. Mr. Hawkins says every confrontation has a rhythm, like a dance. Says knowing when to move is just as important as knowing how to move. Been watching him practice sometimes, early morning when he thinks no one's around. His hands never shake then. The rain intensified, but Tommy remained at his post, recording, every detail in his mind for later entry in his notebook. He'd appointed himself chronicler of Thunder Creek Valley's transformation, understanding instinctively that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Sheriff Cooper, making his way down the street, spotted Tommy and started to object. But something, in the boy's focused determination, made him pause. Instead, he positioned himself where he could protect the young observer if things turned ugly. Knowledge is like water in the desert, Hawkins had told Tommy during one of their morning lessons. Those who have it survive, those who don't. He'd let the thought hang in the air, another lesson wrapped in simple words. Through his binoculars, Tommy noticed something that made his breath catch. The subtle shift in Ezra's posture, the way his hands had grown completely steady, the alertness in his eyes that belied his appearance of elderly vulnerability. In that moment, Tommy understood he was about to witness the unveiling of a truth he'd glimpsed in fragments over the past weeks. The storm clouds gathered darker, and Tommy Chen, self-appointed guardian and chronicler, tightened his grip on his binoculars. Whatever happened next would reshape not just his understanding of Ezra Hawkins, but of strength, wisdom, and the nature of true courage. His notebook waited at home for what might be its most important entry yet. The rain fell steadily. As Jake Sullivan stood before Hawkins' porch, water dripping from the brim of his hat, the tableau held for a long moment, the gang leader's hand hovering near his silver-plated revolver, Marcus tensed like a coiled spring, young Winters shifting nervously in the background. Ezra continued rocking, his weathered hands folded, peacefully in his lap. Been doing some asking around, old-timer, Jake drawled, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a knife in the dark. Heard some interesting stories about a shooter they used to call Lightning Hand. Man who could put 6 bullets through the same hole at 50 paces. Man who disappeared about the same time you showed up in Thunder Creek Valley. Thunder rolled across the mountains as Ezra's eyes met Sullivan's. For a brief moment, the facade of age seemed to fall away, revealing something harder, something forged in gunsmoke and justice. Stories have a way of growing with time, Mr. Sullivan, like weeds after a rain. They say Lightning Hand had a particular way about him, Jake continued, taking a step closer. Never drew first, always gave a man a chance to walk away. But once the shooting started, he let the words hang in the rain-heavy air. Wonder what happened to him? Why'd a man with that kind of reputation end up rocking away his days in a backwater town? Behind his rain barrel, Tommy Chen held his breath, watching the scene unfold through his binoculars. He noticed how Ezra's right hand had slipped beneath the blanket in his lap, how his left maintained its tremor for show. The boy understood he was watching a performance, one that had been running for 15 years. "Maybe," Hawkins replied softly, his voice barely carrying above the storm. He got tired of counting notches on his gun. Maybe he learned there are better ways to measure a man's worth than by how fast he can draw. Marcus spat into the mud. "Sounds like cowards talk to me. Way I figure it, you're either lying about being lightning hand, which means you're about to learn a hard lesson, or you are him, in which case you're long past your prime." Sarah Miller watched from her diner's doorway, her hand tight around her derringer. She saw how Sheriff Cooper had positioned himself with a clear line of sight, how Rose Bennett had quietly ushered other townspeople to safety. The air crackled with the tension of an approaching storm. "Interesting thing about reputations," Ezra continued, his tone conversational despite the deadly undertones of the moment. "They're like shadows, sometimes bigger than the thing casting them, sometimes smaller. But shadows don't tell you much about the substance of a man." Jake's patience wore thin. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver, aiming it at the space between Hawkins' eyes. "Enough philosophy, old man. If you are, lightning hand, prove it. If not, well," his finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "Time to show some respect to the new law in Thunder Creek Valley." What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts would differ in the details. Ezra's right hand emerged from beneath the blanket, empty but steady as mountain stone. In the same motion, his left flicked something, a small stone, a penny, accounts varied, into the air between them. The coin caught the light as it spun, and before it could fall, a single shot rang out. The penny fell at Jake's feet, a perfect hole drilled through its center. But the shot hadn't come from Sullivan's gun. On the porch rail sat Hawkins's revolver, smoke still curling from its barrel. No one had seen him draw, no one had seen him aim. The gun had simply appeared, as if manifested from the rain itself, and spoke once with deadly precision. "That's one," Ezra said quietly, his hands now steady as the mountains themselves. "Care to see what 2 through 6 look like?" Marcus had his gun halfway clear of its holster when Hawkins's voice stopped him cold. "Your trigger finger's itching, son. But notice your boss hasn't moved. He understands what just happened. Do you?" Jake Sullivan stood frozen, his silver-plated revolver still aimed at the old man, but his confidence shattered like a mirror hitting stone. He'd seen fast draws before, had faced down his share of gunfighters. But this was something else. "Entirely! You could have killed me," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "Could have killed all 3 of you," Hawkins corrected gently. "Choose not to. Just like you're choosing right now whether to be smart or proud. One of those choices leads to a long life. The other..." He let the thought hang between them like gun smoke in still air. Ray Winters, young enough to still know fear, had already backed away several steps. His hand, which had been reaching for his gun, now hung limp at his side. He'd heard stories of lightning hand, but seeing was different than believing. "Times have changed, old man," Jake managed, though his gun hand had developed a slight tremor. "World's different now." "World's always changing," Ezra agreed. "Question is, are you smart enough to change it? That penny could have been your gun. Hand. Next time might be. Your choice." For a long moment, the only sound was the falling rain and distant thunder. Then, with deliberate slowness, Jake Sullivan lowered his weapon. His face worked through a complex series of emotions: rage, fear, and finally, a grudging respect. "This isn't over," he warned, but the threat rang hollow against the demonstration they'd just witnessed. "No," Hawkins agreed, his voice carrying, the weight of certainty. But how it ends is still up to you. As Sullivan's gang backed away, Tommy Chen scribbled frantically in his notebook, recording every detail of what he'd just witnessed. He understood that Thunder Creek Valley had just changed irrevocably, not through violence, but through the precise application of skill held in check by wisdom. Sarah Miller let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Sheriff?" Cooper nodded slightly to Hawkins, a gesture of professional respect. And throughout the town, word began to spread in whispers and wondering glances. Lightning Hand hadn't faded away after all. He'd just been waiting, patient as the mountains themselves, for the moment when Thunder Creek Valley needed him most. Rain pattered against the windows of Sarah's diner as the evening crowd huddled over steaming coffee cups, their voices low as they discussed what they'd witnessed. The confrontation at Hawkins' porch had shattered more than just Sullivan's confidence. It had cracked open a mystery that had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years. Rose Bennett spread an old newspaper across one of the tables, its yellow pages crackling with age. "Found this in my father's collection," she announced, smoothing the brittle paper. The headline blazed across the top. "Lightning Hand claims another victory. Notorious Carson brothers fall to territory's most feared marksman." Tommy Chen, allowed to stay up late, given the historical significance of the moment, leaned forward to study the grainy photograph. The man in the image stood straight and tall, 6 guns at his hips, but it was the eyes that caught Tommy's attention, the same steady, measuring gaze he'd seen hundreds of times from Hawkins's porch. It wasn't just his speed, Sheriff Cooper explained, pointing to the article. Lightning Hand had a code. Always gave men a chance to surrender, to choose a better path. They say he could shoot a gun out of a man's hand at 30 paces, disable without killing. Sarah nodded, remembering fragments of conversations over countless cups of coffee. That's why he took the name Hawkins when he came here. After the hawk, sees everything, strikes only when necessary. She paused, gathering old memories. He told me once, though I didn't understand it then, that the hardest part wasn't learning to shoot straight. It was learning when not to shoot at all. The diner's door creaked open, and conversation stuttered to silence as Ezra himself entered, shaking rain from his hat. His hands showed their familiar tremor as he hung his coat, but now everyone understood the trembling for what it was, not weakness, but a reminder of choices made and lives spared. "Suppose there's no point in pretending anymore," he said, quietly, settling into a chair. His eyes fell on the newspaper, and something like sadness crossed his weathered features. Though I'd hoped those stories had been forgotten. "Why here?" Tommy burst out, unable to contain his curiosity. "Why Thunder Creek Valley?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup Sarah wordlessly placed before him. 15 years ago, he began, his voice carrying the weight of long-buried memories. I faced down the worst killer I'd ever met. Man named Jackson Reeves. The name sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. Even Tommy knew the stories of Reeves, a gunfighter so notorious that mothers still used his name to frighten unruly children. Reeves had killed 17 men, Ezra continued, each one a cleaner shot than the last. But what haunted me wasn't his skill. It was the look in his eyes when I finally cornered him. Empty, soulless, like looking into a mirror of what I might become if I wasn't careful. Thunder rolled outside as Hawkins took a slow sip of coffee. I gave him the same chance I gave everyone. Told him he could surrender, face justice, maybe find redemption. Do you know what he said? The diner hung on his every word, even those who'd lived in Thunder Creek Valley for years hearing this story for the first time. He laughed. Said a man's reputation was all he had, and he'd rather die than live without it. Ezra's eyes grew distant. So I did what I had to do. But afterward, looking down at him, I realized something. Every man I'd faced was walking the same path. Each one so caught up in their reputation, their pride, that they couldn't see any other way to live. That's when you decided to disappear, Sheriff Cooper said softly. To become just another old-timer in a quiet town. Ezra nodded. Figured if I could vanish, become someone else, maybe it would show others that a man's worth isn't measured by how many notches he carries on his gun, that there's always another choice. Rose Bennett pulled another document from her collection, a wanted poster offering a $1,000 reward for information on Lightning Hand's whereabouts. Some said you were killed, she mentioned. Others claimed you'd gone to Mexico, or up to Canada. Let them wonder, Hawkins replied. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give a man is the chance to walk away from what he thinks he has to be. Tommy leaned forward, his young face earnest. But today, with Sullivan's gang, you showed them who you really are. A ghost of a smile crossed Ezra's features. No, son. I showed them who they could choose not to be. That penny shot wasn't about proving I'm Lightning Hand. It was about proving there's always another way, if you're wise enough to see it. Sarah refilled coffee cups as the conversation continued, each person adding pieces to the puzzle they'd lived alongside for years. How Ezra had chosen Thunder Creek Valley for its remoteness, its need for something more than just another gun. How he'd built a life based not on speed and accuracy, but on patience and understanding. The tremor, Tommy realized suddenly. It's not real, is it? Real enough, Hawkins replied, letting his hands shake visibly. Reminds me of every trigger I've pulled, every life I've changed. Helps me remember that even the steadiest hand can falter if the heart behind it isn't true. Outside, the storm began to ease, but Thunder Creek Valley had been forever altered. The legend of Lightning Hand hadn't ended 15 years ago. It had simply transformed, like a sword being reforged into a plowshare, into something that could nurture rather than destroy. Sullivan and his gang, Sheriff Cooper mused. They'll be back, won't they? Ezra nodded slowly. Probably. Man like Jake Sullivan has to decide whether his pride is worth more than his future. Same choice I gave Reeves. Same choice I've given every man who thought his reputation was all he had. As the evening deepened, more townspeople drifted into the diner, drawn by the story spreading through Thunder Creek Valley like wildfire. Each one looked at Ezra Hawkins with new eyes, seeing not just the quiet old-timer who fed stray cats, but a man who had chosen to become living proof that legends don't have to end in blood and gun smoke. Thunder Creek Valley awakened to an unsettling silence the next morning. No birds sang in the cottonwoods. No distant coyote calls echoed through the canyons. Nature itself seemed to sense the approaching storm, though the sky remained clear as desert glass. Jake Sullivan and his gang had spent the night in their rented rooms above the saloon, their voices carrying harsh and angry through the floorboards. Those who passed by caught fragments of heated discussion. Threats of revenge mingled with cautious warnings about the fool's game of challenging Lightning Hand. Sarah Miller opened her diner early, serving coffee to anxious townspeople who gathered to share whispered concerns. Through her window, she watched Ezra settle into his rocking chair, his morning routine unchanged despite yesterday's revelation. His hands showed their familiar tremor as he lifted his coffee cup, but now everyone understood the purpose behind. The performance. 3 riders coming in from the north, Tommy Chen reported, slipping through the diner's back door. His network of young observers had been up since dawn, monitoring every approach to town. Looked like some of Sullivan's old crew from Wyoming Territory. Sheriff Cooper, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee, exchanged glances with Deputy Wilson. Jake's, calling in reinforcements, trying to even odds that were never even to begin with. The morning progressed with the taut tension of a drawn bowstring. Sullivan's men arrived one by one or in small groups, each carrying the hard look of men who killed for pay rather than passion. By noon, 14 gunmen had gathered at the saloon, their presence casting a shadow darker than any storm cloud over Thunder Creek Valley. They're positioning men on the rooftops, Tommy reported, his young face serious with responsibility. 2 behind the livery stable, 3 more near Rose's store. Got clear lines of sight to Mr. Hawkins's porch from every angle. Ezra continued his gentle rocking, seemingly oblivious to the web of death being woven around him. But those who knew where to look noticed subtle changes. How his chair had shifted slightly to keep the sun at his back. How the blanket across his lap concealed more than just an old man's chill. Sarah made her way to his porch, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "They're going to try something," she said quietly, refilling his cup. "Jake's pride won't let him walk away, not after yesterday." "Pride's a funny thing," Hawkins replied, his voice carrying no trace of concern. "Makes a man choose death over wisdom, revenge over life. Seen it 100 times. His eyes, sharp as ever, tracked movement on distant rooftops. "But sometimes, if you give a man enough rope, he'll find a better use for it than hanging himself." The crisis broke like a summer storm at high noon. Jake Sullivan emerged from the saloon, his silver-plated revolver gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Behind him came Marcus, Ray Winters, and the new arrivals, a deadly procession that spread out along the street in a carefully planned pattern. "Time we settled this proper, old man," Jake called out, his voice carrying the brittle edge of wounded pride. "You may be Lightning Hand, but there's only one of you. Even legends can't dodge 14 guns at once." Thunder Creek Valley held its breath. Sheriff Cooper had his hand on his revolver, but against so many guns, even official, authority meant little. Tommy Chen, watching from his hidden perch, scribbled frantically in his notebook, recording what might be the last chapter of Lightning Hand's story. Ezra's response came soft as prairie wind. 14 men. Each one thinking he's got the angle, the perfect shot. Each one sure his bullet will find its mark. His hands showed no tremor now as he slowly stood. "But did any of you think to count the mirrors?" The question caught Jake off guard. "Mirrors? What?" "Been placing them these past weeks," Hawkins continued conversationally. "Bit of glass here, polished metal there. Sometimes the best defense isn't speed or accuracy. It's making sure your opponents can't trust their own eyes." As if to demonstrate, sunlight suddenly flashed from a dozen hidden surfaces, window panes, water barrels, carefully angled pieces of glass worked into. Innocent-looking decorations. Each reflection created confusion, making it impossible to be sure which image of Hawkins was real, and which was merely light and shadow. "That's just tricks," Jake snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Won't stop bullets." "No," Ezra agreed. "But it might make you think about what you're really shooting at. Each man gets one chance to walk away. After that..." His hands moved with liquid grace, and suddenly 2 Colts appeared, their barrels catching the sun. "After that, we find out if 14 against 1 are really the odds you're facing, yo." Silence that followed was broken only by the soft creak of Ezra's rocking chair. Every gunman on the street suddenly realized the same thing. In their careful positioning to surround Hawkins, they'd also surrounded each other. Any crossfire would catch their own men in the middle. "Still time to choose differently," Hawkins offered, his voice carrying the weight of decades of similar confrontations. "Your lives against one old man's pride. Ask yourselves, is it worth it?" Ray Winters was the first to lower his gun, youth giving him wisdom his elders lacked. One by one, other hired guns followed suit, each reading the situation with the clarity of men who survived by knowing when to back down. Soon, only Jake remained, his silver-plated revolver pointed at a man who had become a mirror of his own choices. "Can't back down," he growled. "Not after coming this far." "We all come far," Ezra replied gently. "Question is, where do we go from here?" "You're standing at the same crossroads I faced 15 years ago. Same choice. Live with a changed reputation or die with a false one." The moment stretched like shadow at sunset, Thunder Creek Valley watching as Jake Sullivan wrestled not with Lightning Hand, but with his own demons. Pride warred with wisdom, reputation grappled with survival, until finally, with a curse that carried more relief than anger, his gun lowered. "How?" Jake demanded. "How'd you know we'd choose this way?" A ghost of a smile crossed Hawkins's weathered features. "Because 15 years ago I made the same choice. Hardest trigger I ever pulled was the one I chose not to pull at all. As Sullivan's men drifted away, their deadly purpose dissolved by wisdom rather than violence, Thunder Creek Valley released a collective breath. The crisis had passed not in a hail of bullets, but in a moment of understanding that would reshape more than just one afternoon's confrontation. Sarah Miller's diner had become more than just a place to eat. It transformed into the heart of Thunder Creek Valley's transformation. The day after the confrontation, she arranged the tables differently, creating a space where former enemies could sit and share coffee, where understanding might replace antagonism. Jake Sullivan sat alone at first, his pride still nursing wounds, deeper than any bullet could cause. But Ray Winters joined him, then others, until the diner hummed with conversations that would have seemed impossible days before. Never understood why Lightning Hand disappeared, one of Jake's hired guns mused, warming his hands around a coffee cup. Always seemed like running away. But sitting here, watching how things played out yesterday, maybe it took more courage to put the guns down than to keep using them. Tommy Chen had appointed himself unofficial chronicler of these changes, his notebook filling with observations that went beyond simple events to capture the heart of what was happening in Thunder Creek Valley. Mr. Hawkins says every man carries 2 weapons, he wrote. The obvious one in his holster and the harder one in his heart. Says the choice of which to use makes all the difference. Sheriff Cooper found himself reimagining his role in the community. The presence of Lightning Hand hadn't diminished his authority. Instead, it had shown him a different way to maintain order. He began spending more time talking with people, understanding their grievances before they festered into violence. Been thinking about what you said, he told Ezra during their morning coffee. About giving men a choice before they force themselves into corners. Might have prevented half the shootings I've seen if we'd tried that approach sooner. Rose Bennett's General Store became a gathering place where former adversaries found common ground. She'd set up a chessboard near the window, and to everyone's surprise, Jake Sullivan proved to be an adept player. His strategic mind, once focused on domination, now found satisfaction in the elegant dance of knights and pawns. Funny thing, he commented during a game with Deputy Wilson, spent my whole life thinking respect came from making people fear you. Never occurred to me you might get more of it by showing them a better way to be. Marcus, his gold tooth flashing, less frequently in sneers and more often in genuine smiles, discovered an unexpected talent for storytelling. Children who had once hidden from him now gathered to hear tales of his travels, carefully edited to emphasize adventure over violence. Changed man, Sarah observed, watching him demonstrate rope tricks to a group of youngsters. They all are. Really, like watching flowers bloom in desert soil, just needed the right kind of rain. Ray Winters underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The young man who had tried so hard to prove himself through brutality now sought a different kind of strength. He began spending mornings on Hawkins's porch, learning not just about marksmanship, but about the wisdom that governed its use. Ain't just about being fast, he explained to Tommy, who recorded every word. Mr. Hawkins, Lightning Hand, he's teaching me how to see things differently, how to spot trouble before it starts, how to defuse it without ever touching a trigger. Maria. Chen, watching her son's involvement in these changes, gradually relaxed her protective stance. She saw how Tommy was learning not just about courage and skill, but about judgment and wisdom. Your father would be proud, she told him one evening. Not because you're brave, though you are, but because you're learning to be wise. Even the physical appearance of Thunder Creek Valley began to shift. The tensions that had kept people hurrying through the streets with downcast eyes dissolved. Gardens appeared where there had been bare dirt. Fresh paint brightened, weathered. Buildings. The town seemed to be waking from a long winter of fear into a spring of possibility. Like watching a different town entirely, Rose remarked to Sarah as they shared an evening cup of tea. Not just the people, though Lord knows. They've changed, but the very air feels different, lighter somehow. The transformation extended beyond the town limits. Word spread through the territories about Thunder Creek Valley's bloodless resolution. Other communities, facing similar challenges, sent representatives to observe and learn. Man in the saloon. Yesterday, Deputy Wilson reported to Cooper. Said 3 towns west of here are having trouble with road agents. Wanted to know if we'd share our new approach to handling such matters. Sarah noticed how Ezra watched these developments from his porch, his hands maintaining their characteristic tremor for show, but his eyes bright with approval. He'd created more than just a peaceful resolution to one conflict. He'd planted seeds of change that were beginning to sprout in unexpected places. Never thought I'd see Jake Sullivan playing chess with the deputy, she commented one morning, bringing Hawkins his coffee. Or Marcus telling stories to children instead of terrorizing them. Man's nature is like water, Ezra replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Show it a better channel, and it'll flow there just as easily as down the rough paths. Tommy continued his observations, but now he had company. Other young people, inspired by his example, began keeping their own notebooks. They formed a network of watchers, not to spot trouble, but to observe and understand the positive changes reshaping their community. Mr. Hawkins says the real trick isn't changing how people act, Tommy wrote in his journal. It's helping them see why they want to change, giving them a reason to choose different paths. As summer deepened into autumn, Thunder Creek Valley had become something none of its residents had dared imagine. A place where wisdom had replaced violence as the currency of respect, where former enemies shared coffee and conversation, where the legend of Lightning Hand had transformed from tales of deadly accuracy into stories of transformative understanding. The tremor in Ezra's hands remained, but now everyone understood its true meaning, not a sign of weakness or age, but a constant reminder that the hardest strength often lies in choosing not to use the power you possess. Autumn painted Thunder Creek Valley in shades of gold and crimson as Ezra Hawkins began teaching more formal lessons from his porch. What started with Ray Winters and Tommy Chen soon expanded to include an unlikely collection of students. Former gunmen, young townspeople, even Jake Sullivan himself, all gathered to learn from the man they'd once feared or underestimated. "The gun's just a tool," Ezra explained one crisp morning, his steady hands demonstrating the proper way to care for a revolver. Like any tool, its value lies not in itself, but in the wisdom of the hand that holds it. Same iron that makes a gun can make a plow. Same precision that lets you take life can help you protect it. Tommy, still the most dedicated chronicler of these sessions, noticed how the lessons went far beyond marksmanship. Each demonstration contained deeper wisdom, teaching not just how to shoot, but when, and more importantly, when not to. "Watch the hawks," Hawkins instructed, pointing to a pair of raptors circling overhead. "They don't strike at every prey they see. They wait, they watch, they understand. Power isn't about how often you can strike. It's about knowing which targets matter." Jake Sullivan, sitting on the porch steps, absorbed these lessons with particular intensity. The man who had once ruled through fear now found himself learning a different kind of strength. "Been thinking about what you said," he told Ezra during a quiet moment. "About reputation being a cage we build ourselves. Took me 30 years to build mine. Figure it might take that long to build a better one." Sarah Miller noticed how the lessons spread beyond Hawkins' porch. She'd catch snippets of conversation in her diner, former troublemakers discussing patience and understanding rather than dominance and control. Even Marcus, his gold tooth flashing in the autumn sun, had taken to mediating disputes that once would have ended in gunfire. "Strangest thing," Rose Bennett commented one morning. "Caught 2 ranchers about to come to blows over a water rights dispute. Before anyone could draw, Marcus steps in, talks about angles and choices, just like Hawkins does. Had them shaking. Hands inside 10 minutes. The transformation of Thunder Creek Valley attracted attention from surrounding territories. Visitors arrived regularly, drawn by stories of the town where Lightning Hand had chosen to teach peace rather than enforce it through violence. Each one found something unexpected, not just lessons in marksmanship, but deeper truths about strength and wisdom. Understanding comes before action, Ezra would say, his hands steady as he demonstrated how to read approaching riders from their posture and pace. Most fights are won or lost before the first move is made. The trick is seeing clearly enough to choose the right moment, or to choose not to fight at all. Ray Winters, who had once tried so hard to prove himself through violence, became one of the most dedicated students. He had a particular gift for working with young people, teaching them the observation skills Hawkins had shown him. See how the wind moves the grass, he'd explain to his young charges. Everything tells a story if you know how to read it. Mr. Hawkins taught me that the same eyes that spot an ambush can spot a friend in need. Same skills, different purpose. Sheriff Cooper incorporated these lessons into his own approach to law enforcement. Been doing this job 15 years, he told Ezra. Always thought peace came from being the fastest gun. Never occurred to me it might come from being the wisest one. The lessons often extended into the evening hours with townsfolk gathering, on and around Hawkins' porch to hear stories that were really parables about choice and consequence. Even Jake's former gang members, men who had built their lives on reputation and fear, found themselves drawn to these sessions. Every confrontation has 3 moments, Ezra would explain, his voice carrying over the evening crickets. The moment you could walk away, the moment you must decide, and the moment you live with that decision. Most men only see the middle one. Wisdom lies in recognizing all 3. Tommy Chen's notebook filled with these insights, each page capturing not just the words, but the deeper meanings behind them. Mr. Hawkins says true strength isn't in making others bend to your will, he wrote. It's in being strong enough to help them stand straighter on their own. The autumn days grew shorter, but the lessons continued. Ezra taught them to read weather from cloud patterns, to spot approaching riders from dust trails, to understand the difference between genuine threat and empty bluster. Each lesson built upon the others, creating a new way of seeing the world. Man spends his whole life learning to be dangerous, Hawkins told them one evening, his hands showing their practiced tremor as he poured coffee. Real challenge is learning to be dangerous enough to choose peace instead of violence. That's the hardest lesson of all. Sarah watched these changes from her diner window, seeing how Thunder Creek Valley had transformed from a place of tension and fear to one of learning and growth. The same men who had once terrorized her customers now helped maintain the peace, their hard-won wisdom spreading like ripples in a pond. As winter approached, Ezra's lessons took on new dimensions. He taught them about survival, about reading the land and sky, about understanding the rhythms of nature and human nature alike. But always, through every lesson, ran the thread of choice, the understanding that true strength lies not in the ability to harm, but in the wisdom to heal. Lightning Hand didn't disappear, Tommy wrote in his journal. He just transformed, like a sword being reforged into something that could build instead of destroy. And he's teaching us all to do the same. The tremor in Ezra's hands remained, but now it served a different purpose. A reminder not of violence past, but of the constant choice between force and wisdom, between the quick solution and the right one. Thunder Creek Valley had become more than just another frontier town. It had become a place where legends didn't die, but evolved into something greater than their origins. Jake Sullivan stood before the mirror in his rented room above the saloon, studying a face he barely recognized anymore. The hard lines of constant tension had softened, though his eyes retained their watchful nature. His silver-plated revolver lay on the dresser, its surface dulled from lack of polish. No longer a symbol of power, but a reminder of choices made and remade. "Never thought I'd see the day," Marcus commented from the doorway, his gold tooth catching the morning light. Jake Sullivan, the terror of 3 territories, getting ready for a lesson on peace from the man he came to kill. The morning air carried a hint of winter as they made their way to Hawkins' porch, where other students already gathered. Former gunmen sat alongside townspeople, all equal in their pursuit of understanding. Jake took his usual place on the steps, noting how, naturally, this position had become his own. Been thinking about that day with the penny, Jake said during a quiet moment, his voice carrying none of its former menace. Could have killed me clean as breathing. Instead, you gave me something harder, a chance to change. Ezra's eyes, sharp as ever despite his age, studied his former adversary. Killing's easy, he replied softly. Living with who you choose to become, that's the real challenge. You're doing the harder thing, Jake. Every day you choose differently than you did before. The transformation hadn't come easily. Pride died harder than any man Jake had ever faced, and old habits whispered seductively of simpler solutions. But each day brought new lessons, not just in marksmanship and observation, but in the deeper art of understanding oneself. Watch how the young hawk learns to fly, Ezra would say, pointing to the raptors that still circled their valley. First flight's all instinct and fear. Wisdom comes in learning when to glide, when to strike, when to simply soar and observe. Tommy Chen, ever faithful with his notebook, had documented Jake's change with particular attention. Mr. Sullivan doesn't walk the same anymore, he wrote. Used to move like he was looking for trouble. Now he moves like he's looking for ways to prevent it. The turn came one crisp autumn morning when a group of Rough Riders entered Thunder Creek Valley, their intentions clear in their armed stance and hard expressions. Before anyone could react, Jake stepped forward, his hands conspicuously empty. Thinking about causing trouble, he called out to them, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Might want to reconsider that choice. Town's changed since you last heard talk of it. The riders, who had come expecting to find easy prey, found themselves facing something unexpected. Not just armed resistance, but a community united in its commitment to peace through strength rather than violence. Man's got options, Jake continued, unconsciously echoing Hawkins' teachings. Can choose the hard path or the wise one. Town's full of folks who've learned the difference, including me. The riders, reading truth in his stance and wisdom in his words, chose to move on. Sarah Miller, watching from her diner window, marveled at the change. Remember when he first rode in? She asked Ezra later. All swagger and threat. Now look at him, teaching others the same lessons you taught him. Marcus underwent his own transformation, his natural gift for storytelling finding new purpose. He began working with the town's children, teaching them to read signs and signals, to understand danger before it bloomed into violence. Used to. Think power came from making people afraid, he told Ray Winters during one of their practice sessions. Never occurred to me real strength might lie in helping them feel safe. Even Jake's reputation transformed, spreading through the territories not as a tale of violence, but as a story of redemption. Visitors would arrive expecting to find the notorious gunman, only to discover a man who had replaced his gun with wisdom, his threats with understanding. Harder path, Jake admitted during one evening session on Hawkins's porch. Every day I have to choose it again. Every morning I wake up knowing the old way would be easier. But then I remember that penny shot and how it showed me a different kind of strength. Rose Bennett, who had once feared Jake's very shadow, now found herself engaging him in long discussions about the town's future. His strategic mind, once devoted to domination, proved invaluable in planning improvements and resolving conflicts before they could escalate. Strange thing about change, she remarked to Sarah. Once it starts, it spreads like wildfire. Jake, Sullivan becoming a man of peace, who'd have believed it possible. Ray Winters, who had once idolized Jake's violent reputation, now followed a different example. Used to think being tough meant making others back down, he explained to Tommy. Mr. Sullivan showed me, by following Mr. Hawkins' lead, that real toughness is being strong enough to help others stand up. The tremor in Ezra's hands remained steady as ever, but Jake had learned to see it differently now. Not as a sign of weakness or age, but as a reminder that the hardest strength lies in choosing peace when violence would be easier. Every day's a choice, Ezra told him during one of their private conversations. Same as it was 15 years ago, when I chose to become something different than what everyone expected. You're making that same choice now, Jake. Every single day. Thunder Creek Valley watched as its former tormentor became one of its strongest protectors, his transformation, a living testament to the power of wisdom over force. The legend of Lightning Hand had gained a new chapter, not just the story of a gunman who chose peace, but of those he taught to make the same choice. As winter approached, Jake Sullivan's silver-plated revolver gathered dust in its holster, while his hands learned new skills, meditation, chess, the gentle art of helping others find their way to better choices. His reputation, once built on fear, now grew through respect and understanding. Winter blanketed Thunder Creek Valley in pristine white, the snow untouched by violence or fear. From his porch, Ezra Hawkins watched the transformation his presence had sparked continue to flourish. The morning sun caught the frost on his rocking chair, creating patterns like the intricate web of connections that now bound the community together. Sarah, Miller's Diner, had become more than just a gathering place. It was now a center of learning and understanding. At one table, Jake Sullivan taught chess to young apprentices, each move a lesson in strategy and foresight. At another, Marcus shared stories of his own transformation, his gold tooth flashing in genuine smiles rather than sneers. "Strange to think," Sarah commented, bringing Ezra his morning coffee. "How close we came to losing all this to violence. One penny shot changed everything." "Not the shot," Ezra corrected gently, his hands showing their familiar tremor. "The choice behind it. Every man reaches a moment when he must decide who he truly is. Thunder Creek Valley just helped them choose. Wisely." Tommy Chen, now recognized as the town's official chronicler, sat on his usual spot on the porch steps, his notebook filled with observations that would guide future generations. "Mr. Hawkins says a town is like a garden," he wrote. "What grows depends on what you plant, fear or understanding, violence or wisdom." The transformation had spread beyond the valley's boundaries. Other communities sent representatives to learn their methods, to understand how a town once ruled by fear had become a beacon of hope. Sheriff Cooper found himself teaching other lawmen about prevention rather than reaction, about understanding rather than force. "Never thought I'd see the day," Ray Winters mused, watching Jake Sullivan mediate a dispute between ranchers. "Man who taught me to be tough is now teaching me that real strength lies in making peace." Rose Bennett's general store had become a library of sorts, collecting stories and lessons from their shared experience. The wanted posters that once plastered her walls had been replaced by photographs of community gatherings, each one showing how far they'd come. "Lightning Hand didn't disappear," she explained to visitors. "He evolved, showed us all how to transform ourselves into something better than we thought we could be." As snowflakes danced in the winter air, Ezra gathered his students for what they sensed would be an important announcement. Former gunmen sat alongside townspeople, all equal in their pursuit of wisdom, all transformed by the choices they'd made. "Time I shared something," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed porch. "These hands don't shake from age or weakness. They shake from remembering. Every trigger pulled, every life changed, every choice that led me here. I kept the tremor as a reminder that the hardest strength isn't in being deadly, it's in choosing not to be." Jake Sullivan nodded slowly, understanding deepening in his eyes. "Same reason I keep my silver-plated revolver," he admitted. "Not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder of who I chose not to remain." The legacy of Thunder Creek Valley had become something far more powerful than any legend of Lightning Hand's accuracy. It had become a living testament to the possibility of change, a proof that even the hardest hearts could learn wisdom over violence. "Every morning," Ezra continued, "I chose to let these hands shake, to remind myself and others that true power lies not in what you can do, but in what you choose not to do. Each tremor carries the weight of a lesson learned, a life spared, a soul given chance to change." Sarah watched from her diner window as snow continued to fall, each flake adding to the pristine blanket that covered their transformed valley. The peace they'd found wasn't the quiet of fear or submission, but the deep tranquility of wisdom hard-won and freely shared. Mr. Hawkins says every shot leaves 2 marks, Tommy wrote in his final entry. 1 on the target, 1 on the shooter's soul. But wisdom leaves marks too. Not wounds, but seeds that grow into something better than what was there before. As winter deepened, Thunder Creek Valley continued to evolve. Jake Sullivan established a school of peaceful resolution, teaching others the lessons he'd learned at such cost. Marcus turned his gift for storytelling into a way of preserving their history, ensuring future generations would understand the power of choice and change. The tremor in Ezra's hands remained, but now everyone understood its true significance. It wasn't a sign of weakness, but a deliberate reminder that strength comes in many forms, and the greatest power often lies in choosing not to use the power you possess. The legend of Lightning Hand didn't end, Rose would tell visitors. It transformed, like winter into spring, from a story of deadly accuracy into one of life-changing wisdom. And in that transformation, we all found something better than we'd been before. As snow continued to fall on Thunder Creek Valley, Ezra Hawkins rocked gently on his porch, his hands trembling with purpose, watching the community he'd helped create continue to grow and flourish. The penny he'd shot that fateful day had done more than just save lives. It had shown them all that even the deadliest reputation could be transformed into something that nurtured rather than destroyed. The sun set on Thunder Creek Valley, painting the snow in shades of gold and purple, while inside Sarah's diner, former enemies shared coffee and conversation, their weapons gathering dust as their wisdom continued to grow. The legend of Lightning Hand had evolved into something far more powerful than any tale of gunsmoke and notches on a grip. It had become a story of transformation, of wisdom over violence, of the strength found in choosing peace when war would be easier. And in the gentle tremor of an old man's hands, they all found a daily reminder that true legends never die. They just transform into something greater than anyone could have imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.